James Mann is a distinguished journalist and historian who covered China for many years for the Los Angeles Times. His 1999 book, called About Face, was an account of the troubled path of US-Chinese relations after President Richard Nixon had normalised relations between Washington and Beijing in 1972. James's 2004 bestseller, The Rise of the Vulcans, explored President Bush's war cabinet. And among his many prominent books since has been The China Fantasy, How Our Leaders Explain Away Chinese Repression. Now, context is important. This book came out at the high point of Western engagement with the People's Republic of China in late 2006, early 2007. And at the time, George Will, the distinguished columnist from the Washington Post, we had invited George Will, who's now 82, to give the CIS keynote address in 2020, but of course COVID and the lockdowns interfered. But George and I instead did a Zoom discussion on the crisis of American capitalism, and that reached something like 500,000 views, which was extraordinary. But George, who's been writing a column for the Washington Post for 50 years, hard to believe, every week for the Washington Post, twice, 50 years, he said that Mann warns against, quote, McDonald's triumphalism. That is the belief that because the Chinese increasingly eat like us, they are becoming like us. That is related to, quote, the Starbucks fallacy, the hope that as the Chinese become accustomed to many choices of coffee, they will demand more political choices. George Will goes on to say that James Mann's most disturbing thesis is that, quote, the newly enriched Starbucks-sipping, apartment-buying, car-driving denizens of the large cities that American visitors to China see will not be the vanguard of democracy, but the opposition to it. Now, at the time, the distinguished Canadian historian Margaret Macmillan from Oxford, she said the following: James Mann's main target is all those American policymakers aided and abetted by big business, the media, and the Beltway think tanks who have sold a bill of goods to the American people. Professor Macmillan says this is the widespread consensus that China's dramatic economic development will inevitably lead to democracy as its growing middle class demands more rights and freedoms. And she went on to say, the China fantasy raises awkward and important questions. What would it mean for the United States, its allies, and indeed the world if 20 or 30 years from now, so we're talking 2037, a much richer, more powerful China proved to be every bit as authoritarian as the state it is today? And what if that China were one in which the middle classes decided, much as they did in Hitler's Germany, to opt for stability and prosperity over democracy? Now, that was Professor Margaret Macmillan, and before her, George Will in 2007. And with that, please welcome the 2023 Scholar in Residence, James Mann.
I want to look back today on some of our ideas about China and its future, namely what I've called the China fantasy and how it arose and what's happened to it. So first, what is the China fantasy? Or maybe it should be, what was it? It was the deep-seated belief that guided policies for so many years that with ever greater trade, foreign investment, and increasing wealth and a growing middle class, China would gradually, some said inevitably, move towards a more open society, political liberalization, free speech, some said democracy. That belief guided American policy and many other places in the world for decades until ideas shifted to the belief that China, in the past few years, that China would be a very repressive place at home and aggressive overseas for a very long time. So the first question is, when did the China fantasy begin? And it's interesting, there's a submerged debate about this. Of course, I'm right. since I named it. But as America was realizing it was wrong, maybe I think it was 4 or 5 years ago, and coming down from the China fantasy, Kurt Campbell, who is now, in fact, in charge of China and Asia policy for the Biden administration, wrote an article for Foreign Affairs magazine, the leading American foreign affairs journal, in which he said American policy had been based on the wrong assumptions since the time of Richard Nixon's opening to China. And to me, that's just not right. Whatever you could say about Nixon, and lots of things have been said, and maybe a few by me, he didn't believe that through his opening he would change China's political system. I don't think there were any illusions, any fantasies about that. He did write early on that he wanted to bring China into the world, into world diplomacy, but that's about it. He didn't talk about changing the political system. Nixon's policies and those of his successors through the 80s, through Ford, Carter, Reagan, were based overwhelmingly on Cold War considerations, as you know. The need for China's cooperation in combating the Soviets, that whole idea in American military strategy that it was tying down China's antagonism to the Soviets, which well predated the Nixon opening, would tie down 40 Russian divisions along the borders of Asia, which could otherwise be devoted to Europe. And even after the crackdown at Tiananmen in 1989, a fundamental event in U.S.-China relations and China's relations with the rest of the world, it was still fading American policy, the anti-Soviet dimension. And in fact, that's one reason why George H.W. Bush sent Brent Scowcroft on his secret missions to China after the crackdown. So then, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, this dominant anti-Soviet strain of American policy came to an end. But a new, even more powerful motivator came into play: commerce. We all think of China opening up for business in the 70s and 80s, and yeah, it was modest. But by the 90s, the American business community was coming to look upon China as the last great untapped market for trade and investment. And I was talking to Tony Berg here. So did people here. It was just a commonplace prevailing wisdom around the world. But there was an obstacle. This was just after the Tiananmen crackdown, when Chinese repression was on full display as never before. And Congress in 1993 passed a law saying that China would lose its trade benefits with the United States if it couldn't make improvements in its human rights record. And that's the context in which the China fantasy arose. It was an all-purpose rationalization. It said, don't worry, China is, you may be concerned about political repression in China or Tiananmen or something, but China is inevitably going to open up and move towards political liberalization or democracy, meaning that people shouldn't worry about what was going on inside China. Some leading policymakers and academics in the past few years have made the startling claim that we never said it. We never said that. I've had this debate in writing, and the former U.S. ambassador to Beijing, Stapleton Roy, said, I never said that China was going to open up like that. He was off in Beijing during the congressional debates. The people who say that tend to define it very narrowly. They look in official American State Department written policy statements. And they say, I can't find that there's words in there that say we think China is going to open up. They're looking in all the wrong places. The China fantasy was out there, expressed over and over and over again in political debates, in the annual debates about China's trade benefits, in Congress, in the news media, and by leading politicians. To take a couple of representative examples, the Democrat who happened to be president of the United States said, quote, economic change in China would help to increase the spirit of liberty over time. I just think it's inevitable, just as inevitably the Berlin Wall fell. And a Republican leader who was Deputy Secretary of State under George W. Bush, Robert Zoellick, said that cooperating with China was a step towards a democratic China of tomorrow. And why were they saying this? It was really in line with the spirit of the 90s and the early aughts, right after the end of the Cold War. When Bill Clinton stood up in the White House next to the Chinese president, Jiang Zemin, in the mid-90s and said, "You're on the wrong side of history," only a few years after Francis Fukuyama had written his famous essay, The End of History, after the end of the Cold War. Can anyone come up with another explanation of what history meant if it was not political change? It defies explanation. And again, this is the spirit of the times. It was when Charles Krauthammer spoke of the unipolar moment for the United States. It was something that was generally in the air for all countries, but certainly specifically as a great rationalization for trade with China. So I wrote my book, The China Fantasy, in 2007. Why did I do it? I lived in China in the 1980s, and I was regularly amazed that China on the ground, and this is still true today, doesn't feel like, never matches what's being said about it in the West. And then in the 1990s, I'd covered all the debates in Washington, listening to these arguments and wanting to explore why people thought what it was that really underlay their talk about China. So my book detailed the assumptions, but it also, I would just note, highlighted as one part of the book the very language that people choose to dismiss critics of the Chinese regime. I called it the lexicon of dismissal, and it includes words you can still hear today to people who criticize China: China bashing, Cold War mentality, anti-China. Even the Dalai Lama was labeled anti-China, overlooking the fact that it is, after all, possible to love the country of China or be intrigued by it, as I am, and to love Chinese people and to dislike and profoundly disagree with the policies of the Chinese Communist Party and its regime. But the anti-China label seeks to blur that distinction. By the mid-2010s, the China fantasy was coming to an end. Both of the two driving forces beneath American policy had changed. I mean, even in the 90s, you could see that there really, if you wanted to look at American China policy since Nixon, you looked at two things: the Pentagon and the business community. Those are the two driving factors. Pentagon was dominant during the Cold War. The business community became dominant in the 90s and the aughts. And by the mid 2010s, like around 2015 or so, America, first of all, the military dimension had changed. Obviously, China was becoming was developing its military to the point it was becoming ever more concerning to the Pentagon. And secondly, American companies were finding that their designs, their intellectual property were being stolen over and over and over again as Chinese companies were emerging as not partners of American firms, but competitors to them. So one common school of thought says that the China fantasy came to an end because Xi Jinping came to power. I mean, I understand where that's coming from, but I don't think that's the whole truth. China was, after all, it was repressive enough under Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao to lock up dissidents, like, for example, the Nobel Prize winner Liu Xiaobo. And more importantly, the were the larger factors. China obviously remained repressive throughout. Meanwhile, the military and business drivers of American policy had just about reversed. So it wasn't just Xi Jinping. I say that not in defense of him. It was much larger factors. So finally, where are we now? Does the China fantasy still exist? Well, you can still find a handful of die-hard adherents to the fantasy. I did have, not long ago, a former, fairly senior American official, tell me a year or so ago, it's just going to take longer than I thought. And there's a former British diplomat who had written earlier a great book about China, who wrote a book a couple years ago, based in part, I think, on his years of being in the financial community, predicting that Xi Jinping would be overthrown by other party leaders before the party Congress last fall, which obviously didn't happen. And he also predicted that those leaders would open the way, the leaders who overthrew Xi Jinping would open the way for political liberalization and democracy. And he's still now predicting that. So, the fantasy is still out there among people who somehow haven't noticed the power of the Chinese security apparatus, which is greater than that of the economically officials that they're talking to. But I think we can safely say that by and large, most people have come around to the belief that China isn't going to open up for a very long time and that we need to deal with China as it is, not as we dream it to be. So in that sense, I think it's fair to say there's not much left to the China fantasy other than the book, which you can buy. Not much left of the fantasy in the way that it held sway 2 decades ago. Thank you very much.
In early December, CIS invited the former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd to speak here at CIS about the China question. And among other things, the former Prime Minister claimed that unless growing strategic tensions between Washington and Beijing were managed, America could be at war with China by the end of the decade. So I put to Kevin Rudd in the questions and answers section that just a few years earlier, he had attacked those in the Liberal Party who made precisely that warning, specifically the federal Liberal MP, now Shadow Minister Andrew Hastie, and his colleague, the Victorian Senator James Paterson. They had been warning about the strategic risks posed by the rise of China 2016, 2017, 2018. At the time, Kevin Rudd said that Hastie and Paterson were irresponsible, that these Liberal hawks were whipping up national hysteria over China, and he called them, quote, post-pubescent, and warned of a descent into neo-McCarthyism. Well, 5 years later, of course, what was deemed as irresponsible and McCarthyite had become not just the conventional wisdom, but the subject of Kevin Rudd's latest book. And with that, please welcome Victorian Senator James Paterson.
Tom, thank you very much for those kind words and for having me here today. I made the unpardonable sin of agreeing with Kevin Rudd 5 years before he agreed with himself. And there is nothing worse than being right about something earlier than someone else is right about something, and you can never be forgiven for that. It is a real pleasure to be back at the CIS today. I'm very proud of my long association with the CIS, which it now goes for about 15 years. And I know some of you in the audience have had a much longer association with the CIS than that, but to be fair, proportional to my life on this earth, it's pretty high percentage. It's an honour to be here with James today because sometimes in Australia I'm regarded as being ahead of the curve on China, but he was well and truly well ahead of the curve. I started speaking out on these issues really in early 2017, not 2007, and so I'm in awe of someone who called that issue so right so early. And the topic of James' discussion today was America's China fantasy, which he is the best qualified to speak about. I just wanted to briefly reflect on Australia's China fantasy and then look forward to the discussion with all of you. Because Australia suffered from a similar but distinctive fantasy about China, and it is not exactly the same as America because Australia is not a superpower, and we didn't have the perspective that we ourselves could realistically change China's trajectory and put them on a path to democracy. But we did have our own delusions about China, and in particular the one that was rife for the first 2 decades of this century in political circles and in the business community, was that Australia did not have to choose, on the one hand, between our major economic partner and on the other, between our security partner. And it was very commonplace to hear senior political leaders and business figures say that Australia would never be forced to make that choice, that we could maintain both a close economic and trading relationship with China and a close security relationship with the United States. And I think reflecting back on that delusion was that there were 2 key flaws in it. Firstly, we wrongly believed that the Chinese would agree to separate economics and security, that we believe they didn't see those 2 things as inextricably linked, and that they would tolerate us having a close security partnership with the United States and a close trading relationship with them. Well, if ever we still believed that delusion, that was shattered by the economic coercion campaign that China launched against Australia in 2020, and the very explicit list of demands, the 14 demands, which all went to the core of Australia's status as a sovereign liberal democracy and asked us, in exchange for the economic relationship, to fundamentally change who we are as a country and effectively to leave the Western alliance system and become a subservient vassal state to China. I'm very proud that Australia didn't make that choice and that we woke up at that moment. But the other part of that delusion was the idea that Australia should want to separate our economics from our security, that we should want to divide our trading relationships from our security relationships, that was in our interest. And again, the 2020 experience has shattered that delusion. Happily, in my view, we stood up to that coercion and we learned that our economy was far more resilient than we might have feared it would have been, that our trading relationships were robust and that our goods were high quality and could be placed in other markets all around the world despite the sanctions that were put against us. But that's just on the export income earning side of the economy. The vulnerability that I think we really have been drawn to our attention as a result of the pandemic is our dependency on critical imports from China and the vulnerabilities that causes for our country. Now, I'm a free trader, I'm a free marketeer like everyone else at the CIS. I do not want to pull up the drawbridge and I do not think Australia should make everything ourselves. Specialisation has brought great gains for us and many others in the world. But I think we are learning when it comes to critical goods that are important to the functioning of our society and our economy, that we do either have to be able to make it ourselves, source it from our trusted friends and partners, or stockpile it. We can never again find ourselves in the position we were at the start of the pandemic of being dependent on a potential adversary state, an authoritarian state, for the things that we need to make our society function. And so that Australian-Chinese fantasy, that Australia-Chinese delusion has been punctured. And I think it's not before time because we are heading into a very dangerous period of the next 5 or 10 years. I do agree with Kevin Rudd that it could be as early as 2027 that we could be facing conflict in our region. And we will face some very difficult choices then that will be much more serious than the ones we've had to face in the last few years. Thank you very much for having me and I look forward to the discussion.
Jim, this China fantasy that you talk about, particularly in the 1990s, could you also talk about a Russia fantasy in the Washington foreign policy establishment? Because with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Empire in the late 80s, early 1990s, there was a consensus, wasn't there, among Democrats and Republicans that Washington had a special role to play in helping Russia make the conversion to democracy.
Well, that's right, Tom. It was a little different. First of all, the obvious difference is in China was remained a communist country when the Soviet Union collapsed. I think there were those in Russia, in the United States. This wasn't as well articulated, but who thought that Russia inevitably was going to become a democracy. If so, they hadn't read a lot of Russian history. Yeah,
Richard Nixon, who died in 1994, had met with President Clinton in 93 and early 94 several times to talk about the importance of the American government, taxpayers playing a prominent role in helping Russia make the transition. But by 94, when one of his last interviews, the guy who opened relations with communist China told his former speechwriter, the prominent New York Times columnist William Safire, that all that trade and engagement with China, my God, we might have created a new Frankenstein.
Yeah, as I've said, I think Nixon and Kissinger were in different. I mean, they teamed up and very well at the time on the opening to China, but they really had different mindsets. Nixon really was, his concern throughout his career was the big powers. I mean, there's a part of it he loved. I am the person who can talk to Khrushchev. I can do the kitchen debates. I love de Gaulle. I think that if Nixon had lived, and he was starting to do it, as you mentioned, he would have become quite hawkish on China. Kissinger became basically first territorial and then commercial on China.
Yeah, I mean, we don't want to deviate too much, but we're talking about the China fantasy, and Henry Kissinger, who turns 100 this year, 100 years of age,
right,
still speaking, still giving testimony before Congress, still writing, had a 1,500-word op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal yesterday.
And I don't think I'm not sure that people write that for him. I'm truly amazed at his longevity.
100 years of age this year.
Yeah.
But he has said several controversial things about China, most notably after the Tiananmen Square massacres in 1989. Take us back to that.
Yeah, after the massacre, American discussions of China were in complete turmoil, and Kissinger rushed to the defense of Deng Xiaoping by saying no country in the world would have allowed that many protesters to gather in the center of its city, which simply was not true. But somehow Kissinger, he may even have believed it. I don't know. He really was never in touch with populist sentiments anywhere.
Irving Kristol, a prominent neoconservative, once described a neoconservative as a liberal mugged by reality. James, you're obviously a liberal politician, but you're also a classical liberal. Just tell us about the process, how you got mugged by reality on China.
Well, I would probably say I'm a neoconservative mugged by reality. I remember, Tom, your dissenting views when it came to the war in Iraq, and with the benefit of hindsight, if we had known what we know now about the trajectory that China is on, I think we would have made very different decisions at that time, given the massive cost America incurred in that and the enormous impact that has had on America's appetite to be a leader and engaged in the world. It was a hugely costly decision. But at the time, we were in that world of that unipolar moment that James was talking about. We thought that the limits on American power were so distant as not to be a problem, and we thought that America could do it all, and we were wrong. For me on China, the wake-up moment came during the debate about an extradition treaty with China in March 2017. I'd been in the Senate on the backbench for a year, and the Turnbull government, in its wisdom, decided that we should ratify this long-dormant, previously negotiated extradition treaty. John Howard had first negotiated it but never ratified it, and nor in their wisdom did Kevin Rudd, Julie Gillard or Tony Abbott, but Malcolm Turnbull sought to do so. And I was instinctively uncomfortable on a classical liberal basis that we should never send anybody to a jurisdiction that has a 99.9% conviction rate. And I also feared that it would be a very powerful tool of coercion over the Chinese diaspora in Australia, who are already a community very much beset upon by Beijing and coerced and intimidated. But imagine if the Chinese government was able to say to them, if you don't do as we ask, we will take you back to China and you face our justice system. So I told the then Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, that I was the first backbencher to do so, that I would cross the floor and vote against it in the Parliament. And at that point in the political debate, only Corey Bernardi as an independent Conservative senator and the Greens had announced their opposition to it. Labor was working out their position. And subsequently to it leaking that I and others, Andrew Hastie, Tim Wilson, many others, were opposed to it and that were willing to cross the floor, did the Labor Party declare their position on it, and it was clear it was going to fail in the Senate. And so the Turnbull government then withdrew the treaty. And if you look back at that now, nearly 6 years on, no one would think it's a good idea today if anyone proposed that. But at the time, it was a reasonable proposition in most circles.
And hindsight is a wonderful thing. You mentioned Iraq in this instance, but, Peter Costello recently was at one of our events in Melbourne, and we had a discussion on China policy, and he raised the question that in 10, 20, 30 years, we might look back at this period and say we regretted feeding the beast with our huge iron ore sales to China. What's China doing with all our iron ore?
Well, one of the great differences between Australia and the United States on the China relationship is that it's pretty hard to steal intellectual property from a shipment of iron ore or coal or LNG. And so we haven't suffered in the same way that the business community in America has in having their IP shamelessly stolen by the Chinese and then the economic consequences that follow. It's one of the reasons why I think we have lagged a bit in the public debate on those issues. It's certainly true, Tom, that some of the iron ore that we sell to China are probably going into not just apartment towers but aircraft carriers. But to be fair to Australia...
You don't think that the Chinese will power their aircraft carriers with wind and solar?
No, probably not. Probably not. But to be fair, the prices and the income that we earn from selling iron ore and coal and LNG and other things to China, we are using to pay for our nuclear submarines. So we have a symbiotic relationship in that sense, and it is still remaining a very significant trading relationship and probably will for many years. But we do need to think about what would happen if there was conflict initiated by China in the Taiwan Straits. How would Australia respond, and what we would do about a third of our national income?
Yeah, we are so heavily dependent on China for trade. That was really evident during the pandemic. But Jim, tell us about the business community in the United States. They're more divided between, am I right in saying, Wall Street and Silicon Valley?
That's right. When I do say that overall the climate in the business community has changed. Just obviously, the business community is very diverse. The one component of the business community that has not changed its view much on China is Wall Street and finance. I mean, it's still true that if you show an article about China needing to to reform its pension system, and that people in Wall Street get weak knees thinking about the possibilities. So that the old love of the China market has never quite been realized for Wall Street. They're, in a sense, they're behind. I mean, American Express and companies like that couldn't set up in China, so they're still hoping. Meanwhile, certainly the tech sector, because of IPR issues, and the manufacturing sector have both changed their views.
James, on Australian business, do you get the sense now that with the so-called thaw in relations between Canberra and Beijing, I mean, we have had a meeting between the Prime Minister and the Chinese President, and the Foreign Ministers have expressed pleasantries, and some of those sanctions on Australian products are starting to ease. Do you think that with this thaw, the business community in Australia thinks that, yes, the good old days are returning, and this is a view that's widely held by not just the business community, but academics, former policymakers, former Prime Minister Paul Keating?
Look, it is a very good thing that the dialogue has resumed with China. I thought it was enormously unproductive that they refused to meet with the previous government, and I give the new government credit for reinitiating that conversation. That's important, not least because Xi Jinping is concentrating power around himself with sycophants and supporters, and it may only be foreign leaders who can tell him truthful things about the world and its views on China. So that is really important. But I am a bit anxious that some in the business community, universities and other places, haven't learnt the lessons or are very keen to forget the lessons of the last few years and are enthusiastically jumping back on the bandwagon thinking that things will go back to normal. One business leader called the meeting between Albanese and Xi as a tremendous reset. Now, that's despite the fact that the Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, has been at pains to say this is not a reset. We are not seeking a reset. We do not want a reset. We are never going back to that world. But there are some people in our community who do want to go back to that world, and they are entitled to their opinions. But I think they are forgetting what we have learnt in the last few years.
You're talking about lessons learned. Your critics would say, did the Liberal Party learn lessons by the sort of hawkish sentiments that the then Prime Minister Scott Morrison, the then Defence Minister, now Opposition Leader Peter Dutton said about China? I mean, politically speaking, at last May's federal election, a lot of ethnic Chinese voters didn't vote for the Liberal Party in some contentious seats. James?
There's no question that there are political lessons for my party of the last few years. And as I was saying before, I got my start in these debates out of a concern for and an attempt to protect the Chinese diaspora from foreign interference. So many of my strongest supporters are in the Chinese-Australian diaspora. And the last thing I want is a strained relationship between the Liberal Party and the Chinese-Australian community. And we certainly have to think carefully about how we make it even clearer than we have before, the distinction that James talked about between the CCP and the Chinese people. The Chinese people are not morally culpable for the crimes of the CCP. They had no hand in choosing them, and China's Australians were even less directly responsible than that. So there's no question we have to be careful about that. I think the rhetoric did get heated at times and was over the top at times. I've never used language like Manchurian candidate or anything like that, despite being very concerned on these issues and speaking out for them for some time.
Despite engaging in McCarthyite tactics, according to the former Prime Minister. We'll take questions very soon. Jim, before we take questions, let me put you on the spot. You mentioned the unipolar moment in the 1990s, the term coined by the distinguished columnist Charles Krauthammer. Hasn't the Iraq War 20 years ago next month really exposed the limits of American power and influence in the world? Can America be a major player in the world in Europe with respect to Ukraine and Russia, the Persian Gulf with respect to Iran, and East Asia with respect to China? Should it redefine its role in the world and focus more on Asia, where we truly face a menacing, rising great power?
Well, let me take those in order, I think. Yes, I think the Iraq War was definitely the turning point on the limits of American power. Some would have thought that lesson was learned in Vietnam many decades earlier, but for sure I agree with that. Secondly, I don't think it's a choice between Europe and... Wait, what was the second question?
America's focus on Europe via Russia, the Persian Gulf via Iran, and also East Asia via China. In other words, can America still walk and chew gum in three major spheres?
Oh, well, the second thing I was going to point out is, and what's changed since the unipolar moment is, I don't think that, at least at the policy level, I don't think that policymakers in Washington think of it as unipolar anymore. There's a little bit of lip service to what Madeleine Albright called the indispensable nation. But as you've seen over the last year, and as you've seen over the last 3 or 4 years in Asia, the United States acts in concert with its allies. And beneath the surface of that, when the allies don't necessarily agree with something, this kind of came up in the debate over tanks for Ukraine. When the allies don't agree, the U.S. holds off until they do, so the biggest change. People say that American policy or foreign policy has been the same from Trump to Biden. And I don't think that's right at all. I mean, Biden was deeply hostile to the idea of alliances.
The danger, the broad cross-section of the Western governments and Western people support the NATO mission against Russia.
Right.
But is there a danger that Russia will be pushed closer and closer to an old enemy in China, and China might be further emboldened by this relationship with Russia?
I think that's happening anyway, and it was, as you could see, since it was just before the invasion of Ukraine, Russia and China were moving in that direction. One last thing on Europe versus Asia, that's one where I disagree. I think that, I guess I can understand that from an Asian perspective. The Europeans worry that the United States has moved towards Asia. I think the United States has been focused for much of its history on both, and I think John Mearsheimer, the true realist, would say the United States can carry out policies in both Europe and Asia.
Well, I'm not sure. Yeah.
Okay.
No. He spoke here a few years ago, but he's certainly been bullish about the idea of America pivoting to Asia.
Right.
But I think, in his view, Russia might change things. Okay, it's time for Q&A, and our first question comes from, just look for the raving mic. Yes, sir.
Hi, thanks for coming. So if a war were to break out over Taiwan between China and the US, how much involvement would Australia be willing to accept in such an event, and why? Thanks.
It's a question for James Paterson.
Yeah, I was going to say.
I think that, James. Look, it's very dangerous for me to engage in hypotheticals like that. What I would say is that it would be extremely detrimental not just to China and Taiwan, but the whole region and the world if that were to happen. And everything we are trying to do as a country over the next few years is about preventing that through deterrence. It really is the whole rationale of the AUKUS agreement that Australia wants to make a contribution to the collective deterrence effort led by the United States, but supported by others in the region, including Japan. Because if that event were to happen, it would just fundamentally change the world overnight. And I don't think many Australians, many Westerners realise how consequential it would be for America's position of leadership in Asia, for all of our standard of living, and for many, many lives that would be lost. So we're in the prevention business, and we can do that by being really credible with our capability and very clear with our intent.
Jim, there are 5 US treaty allies in East Asia, obviously Australia, Japan, South Korea, but there's also the Philippines and the Thailand.
Right.
Now, over the last few years, the Philippines and Thailand have been getting pretty close to the Chinese government. What's your sense of their position on the broader US alliance network in East Asia vis-a-vis China?
Yeah, I think Thailand has for a long time been becoming ever closer to China. And I don't know in any kind of conflict, I'm quite sure that Thailand would not be a country the United States could count on.
Why is it a treaty ally?
Momentum, history.
The end of the Cold War. Philippines?
Philippines is something different. I mean, it's true that Duterte was becoming close to China, but Philippines obviously has had a long history with the United States, and including especially a defense relationship. So it did not surprise me that much. It only surprised me that the United States didn't take the initiative earlier to do what it has done in the last few months.
Clarify, the Filipinos essentially kicked the Americans out of Subic Bay and the Clark Air Force in the early 1990s, but now they're clamoring for US security guarantees, correct?
Right. Well, so let's go back to the 90s. They didn't see any threat, they felt free to say we don't need American bases here. And now they feel differently.
Next question.
Hi, thank you. Question for Jim. China's been a dictatorship or a totalitarian style government for probably 2,000 years. It was possibly ambitious of America to think that they could change that in 30 to 40 years. Maybe the dream is still alive, and maybe it is a 100-year project to see some proper reforms in China.
Well, the first thing I'd say is it's not a straight line. First of all, I don't think it was totalitarian a long time ago. I think in the last couple of years, particularly during COVID, it managed to qualify. But I lived in China in the 1980s, in the age of reform, and there's no way it could have deserved the name totalitarian. It was opening up within limits. There was never any discussion of limit of about the party's rule. But they were talking very seriously with the approval of the head of the Chinese Communist Party, Hu Yaobang. They were talking about opening to media criticism of government policies. They were talking about creating a real legislature, the National People's Congress, which would have limited, I emphasize limited, but authority to review government policies. So I don't think it's been a straight line of totalitarianism, and I think that I predict that the party is going to be in control of China for a long time, unlike some of these other people. But I can see it going through a phase of opening up again. These are fluctuations of whether it's opening a little bit or tightening a little bit.
Next question.
Hi, thanks. Question for the Senator. So you talk about the need or even the urgency to decouple supply chains from China. The implication there being that developed markets and some emerging markets do need to really ramp up capex to be able to do so. Now, developed markets do have very tight labour markets at the moment, and so the risk is that you embed structurally inflation at a time where we're already sort of dealing with cost of living pressure. So how do you reconcile economic decoupling at the sake of the middle class?
It's a really good question, and I should be clear, I'm not an advocate of complete economic decoupling. That is unrealistic and unachievable on the short and medium term at the very least. The reason why Australia and China trade with each other in such great numbers is not because we approve of each other's political systems or agree with each other's philosophies, but because we are complementary. We happen to have a lot of things that they need, and they happen to make a lot of things that we need, and no government policy is going to fundamentally change that economic question. But what we are seeing, and whether we like it or not, this is the world we're heading into, is at the very least a decoupling in the tech sector, led by the United States, but really in response to the decoupling that China initiated itself, particularly in the tech world. China wants to be independent and free from obligations of American tech companies, and Western democracies have demonstrated they're also equally uncomfortable having, for example, Huawei deliver our 5G network, or in recent times, Chinese surveillance companies provide our CCTV cameras at government sites, thankfully. So that's happening, and there's nothing we can do to change that. That's pretty fundamental, and I think there is going to be a kind of a bifurcated tech world that we're going to be living in. But your warning about the economic implications of trying to drive that at a national level is absolutely right. And there are a lot of countries in the world that won't neatly fit into either camp, that will make choices based on individual incentives and circumstances, and we can't be guaranteed that they choose to adopt and live in our economic system or our tech system if the offer that they get on the other side is sufficiently compelling.
I grew up in England with the sainted Margaret as a key person in our household. When I drifted left, my father used to take me aside and point out that communism and the centralised state didn't work. He had some wonderful stories for the Hungarian shoe building industry, and it didn't work. So whenever I wanted to talk about right and wrong and rights and all the rest of it, he would say, well, let's not worry about that. It just doesn't work. Now I've got two very bright economist 40-year-old sons, and I try the same thing with them. And it doesn't work when we talk about China, because they've been to China and they've got friends in China, and the standard of living appears to be pretty high. Now, is there an economic argument that I can use against them? Because I'm worried about them drifting left, and I haven't got a good argument as to why they're wrong.
Well, I can, as head of CIS, I can answer that, and as someone who's a great admirer of Margaret Thatcher's, just tell them you don't tax a loss, you tax a profit. Only capitalism will provide the revenue that we need to provide health and education and welfare and infrastructure and defence and so on and so forth. Simple as that. Tax profit. So the more profitable companies become, the more capitalist we are, the more likely you're going to get revenues to help pay the things that your children prize.
Well, you must come around and talk to them.
No, better still, they should become members of CIS. Okay, next question. Yes.
Thank you both very much. My question for Jim Mann is, was Xi so paranoid as to be stupid and wreck China itself because they were on the verge of controlling the tech world, the financial world, and so many other things, that if they kept on going the way they were, instead of cracking down on all their tech entrepreneurs who were doing so well, making so much money for China, to fund their navy and their army, and they didn't have to take over those islands in the South China Sea, did they? I mean, why did he do it? Is he so paranoid that he will lose control and that the party will lose control?
Well, you said it. That would be my first answer. That he became increasingly preoccupied with internal stability. First of all, so his early years were characterized by his drive against corruption. And it turned out that he was particularly interested in finding corruption among his political enemies within the party. But he is concerned about the stability of the party. And that includes a fear that businessmen will become wealthy enough and independent enough to be a source of opposition to him or to finance in some way opposition to him.
Yes, next question. Thank you. Paul Kirby from Kirby McClintock. Just a question to Jim. I had the pleasure of having a cab ride recently with a migrant from Djibouti in Africa. And he reminded me that in Djibouti they've had the Road and Belt Initiative from China. Mm-hmm. And his comment to me was that pretty soon we're going to be adopting the Chinese renminbi as our currency, and that we're all going to be speaking Chinese. So it just had me thinking about you saying that you think China will open up, but the Road and Belt Initiative in Africa and other places around the world seems to suggest to me that China is just shoring up resources and supply chain for the future so they don't have to open up, because they've got a potential stranglehold on some of these nations where they're beholden to them.
Yeah, I don't see those two things as contradictory. I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative is overseas. When I spoke about opening up, I was really talking about at home and really talking about a degree of letting people speak, letting there be a little bit of press criticism. I can see that happening. I'm not sure that that opening up applies to their foreign policies at all. Well, let me leave it there. Okay.
Mark.
Yep, my question is, in the fallacy and in the way you identified it, did you identify how it started, who the main proponents were, and how they thought that the pressure for political rights and other liberties might occur out of a middle class that's developed in China when, not always, but if you look back in history, particularly in Western history, you have a lot of incrementalism interspersed with violent and bloody revolution, regicide, whatever you want to look at, to bring about mass political change or war. How did those people that thought this would come about? I'm imagining they weren't thinking violent revolution. So what were they thinking would bring this political pressure?
There's a part of the book that I left out of my discussion, which is what was going on in East Asia in the 80s. So during the 1980s, Taiwan went from dictatorship to a democratic government. So did South Korea. And so there was a school of thought that this was something, somehow a trend, something in the air in East Asia. Again, it fit precisely with the idea of the end of history. But there were regularly people who talked about this, said, look what happened in South Korea, look what happened in Taiwan. And what did they leave out of that? They left out the security dimension. They left out that Taiwan democratized at a time when it was under pressure, very strong pressure from the United States to do so. It was the United States Congress in this case. South Korea very similarly. And China's relationship to the United States is entirely different. So why they went from Taiwan and South Korea to China, I can't imagine. It was a real fallacy, but it was cited over and over and over again.
Just before we go, is there? Oh, yes. So Sue Winniebank. Yeah.
Just a quick question to Jim and James, actually. But to what extent do you believe that China's internal system, its ideology, drives its external behaviour? Or to what extent do you believe systemic forces are at play, a la Zhong Yishang and other realists?
I'll go first and Jim will give a better answer after. This is another issue which Kevin Rudd and I agree. He's just completed a doctorate on Xi Jinping thought at Oxford University and wrote a really great essay excerpting it, if you don't have the time to read the whole thing. And it really does make this point well that we need to take the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party seriously. He's not the first person to say that. My colleague Andrew Hastie said it 5 years ago, and people like Matt Pottinger in the United States and others have been making this argument for a while. But too many people in the West have said that the ideology is a pretense, that it's not real, that it's not really a Marxist-Leninist political party, and they've made a grave error in doing so. And that's probably undergirded a lot of the bad decisions and the naive approaches to China, that they are a communist party in name only, just because when you go to China, it looks and feels like a capitalist country, but that doesn't mean it's not a Marxist-Leninist political party.
Yeah, I think Kevin Rudd's words are that the CCP has in recent times moved to the Leninist left on politics, the Marxist left on economics, and the nationalist right on foreign policy.
And that's the one thing I would add, since the question started with foreign policy. Believe it or not, old timers like me can remember times when Chinese nationalism was well suppressed in the 1980s, and even in the 70s, and so the idea that China was driven entirely by a sense of the century of humiliation. I never heard the phrase in China in the 80s. What happened, and who were the enemies of the Chinese Communist Party in the 70s and 80s? What were the campaigns against? The landlord class. It was domestic economic interests in China. It was after the Tiananmen crackdown, the party feared an ideological breakdown, and that's when the nationalist campaign started. And they were, again, this was at home, but it had a foreign policy dimension to it increasingly as time went on.
Now, during the course of the last month, Jim Mann and I have had the great thrill of going around the country, Brisbane, Melbourne, Canberra, here in Sydney, to do various events on China policy. And part of the road tour has been with another scholar in residence and a colleague of ours here at CIS for the last few months, Alice Hahn. Alice is also a scholar in residence, as I said, exceedingly young, Australian educated, but then she went to Harvard University where she studied modern history under the tutelage of the great British historian Neil Ferguson, long-time past guest here at CIS. Neil suggested that I reach out to Alice, and I could tell immediately that Alice is a future star in our world. And then she's gone to Stanford, where she has a master's degree. And mark my words, Alice Hahn is a major player in the China policy debates in years to come. And with that, it's a great pleasure to welcome her to give the vote of thanks. Please welcome Alice Hahn.
Well, thank you, Tom, for that remarkably kind introduction. So I've been studying China for a few years now, very closely, and it's my daily profession, so to speak. And it's definitely been a profession that's filled with a great deal of sensationalism and bombast and fantasy, to borrow a term from Jim's book. So it's always refreshing to see two very objective and thoughtful voices on China, Senator James Paterson and the scholar in residence for 2023, James Mann. I've had the pleasure of actually being a scholar in residence here over the last few months at CIS, and towards the tail end of my experience, I met Jim and his wonderful wife Carolyn, and we went on a bit of a roadshow across Australia, talking at great depth about China. And I have been observing Jim very closely. He hasn't known this, but I was trying to figure out why he was so prophetic in China fancy, and I think I boiled it down to three main reasons. Number one, he has the keen criticality and ability to sift out the truth of a story, and that's because he's a journalist. Number two is, as a historian, he's able to go see beyond the fluctuations of the day-to-day news cycle and actually see the longue durée of history and understand China on that basis. And number 3, and sorry to be facetious, I would say is that he's married to an even greater historian who's a historian of ancient Greece and Rome, hence the Delphic prophetic capabilities that he has in his books. It's been a real pleasure, needless to say, to learn from Jim and to be at CIS. None of this would happen, none of this convening of ideas and talent and people without the amazing Tom Switzer and his team here at CIS. We need the medicine of well-researched, thoughtful, objective, intellectually honest places like CIS. So that behooves me to say, please continue to support, and if you don't, please support CIS. It's an amazing place. Thank you.
For decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.